What happens when a soul, convinced it is a ghost, is seen for the very first time? 18-year-old Ilara, whose name meant moonlight in the language of her ancestors, felt like less than a shadow. She stood at the edge of a dusty Wyoming highway, the setting sun painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple, a reflection of the bruises on her spirit. The weight of the new life growing within her was a terrifying, sacred secret, a single drumbeat in the vast, lonely silence of her existence. She had been walking for days, running from a past that was a snake coiling around her ankles, its fangs dripping with shame and fear. The reservation she had fled was a place of ghosts, the ghost of her grandmother's loving smile, the ghost of her own innocence, and the phantom of a man whose touch had become a brand of dishonor. Now, she was a ghost herself, haunting the edge of a world that had no place for her, whispering prayers to the spirit of the wind to simply carry her away. Each car that sped past was a gust of wind, a reminder of her invisibility. They were worlds of warmth and purpose, leaving her in their dust. Her hand rested instinctively on her belly, a gesture of both protection and despair. This child deserved the shelter of a warm teepee, the song of a loving family, the steady heartbeat of a home. All she could offer was the open road and a heart shattered into 1,000 pieces, like turquoise dropped on stone. Just as the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the landscape into the deep indigo of twilight, the rumble of an approaching truck grew louder. Unlike the others, this one slowed, its headlights cutting through the dust and illuminating her like a startled doe. It was an old, battered Ford, the color of rust and prairie dirt, and it pulled over onto the shoulder a few yards ahead of her. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The driver's side door creaked open, and a man emerged. He was tall and lean, silhouetted against the dying light. He wore a cowboy hat, its brim low, and moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who understood the land and its rhythms. He didn't approach her directly, but walked to the front of his truck, leaning against the grill as if he were just watching the stars begin to prick the velvet sky. He gave her space, a silent offering of respect that was more valuable than water in this desert of indifference. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind whispering through the sagebrush and the ticking of the cooling engine. Ilara watched him, her hand still pressed to her belly, ready to run. But he made no move toward her. He simply stood there, a solid, calming presence against the vast emptiness of the plains, a single, steady point in her spinning world. "It's a cold night to be walking," he finally said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, like distant thunder. It wasn't a question demanding an answer, but a simple statement of fact. "There's a storm coming in from the north. You can smell the rain on the wind." Ilara hugged herself, the gesture pulling her thin jacket tighter around her secret. I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely a whisper, stolen by the wind. She wasn't fine. She was breaking apart, and the coming storm felt like a fitting end to her journey. The man nodded slowly, as if accepting her lie for what it was, a shield. "My name is Jesse," he said, pushing the brim of his hat up slightly. In the faint starlight, she could see his face was weathered, kind, and his eyes held a deep sadness she recognized, for it mirrored her own. "My grandmother used to say a person's name is their spirit's map. It tells you where you've been and where you're going." He looked at her, his gaze direct but not demanding. "Do you need a ride to a safe place?" The offer of a safe place was a foreign concept to Ilara. Safety was a memory from a time before, a warm blanket on a winter night in her grandmother's lodge. Since then, her world had been a landscape of threats, yet something in this man's quiet demeanor disarmed her. He hadn't offered her a ride to town. He had offered her a destination she no longer believed existed. She took a hesitant step toward the truck, then another. The snake of her past hissed a warning, reminding her of the danger of trusting men, of the poison in their promises. But the child within her gave a gentle flutter, a silent plea for warmth, for a reprieve from the cold, lonely road. It was this small, insistent life that made her brave. "Ilara," she whispered, her own name feeling strange on her tongue. Jesse nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. He opened the passenger door for her, the small courtesy a gesture of respect she hadn't been shown in a long time. As she climbed into the cab of the truck, the scent of leather, hay, and rain filled her senses. It was the scent of the earth, the scent of work, the scent of a life connected to something real. It was the first breath of safety she had taken in months. Jesse's home was not a sprawling ranch house, but a small, simple cabin nestled in a valley carved by a winding creek. It was made of dark, weathered logs and seemed to grow out of the land itself, surrounded by towering cottonwood trees whose leaves whispered in the night wind. A single light glowed in the window, a warm, golden eye in the vast darkness. It wasn't just a house. It felt like a sanctuary. Inside, a fire crackled in a stone hearth, its light dancing across a room filled with the comfortable clutter of a life lived alone. Books were piled on a worn leather armchair, a half-finished wood carving sat on a table, and the air smelled of coffee and wood smoke. It was a space that was wholly masculine, yet it held a gentle, quiet peace that immediately soothed the ragged edges of Ilara's soul. He showed her to a small guest room, the bed covered with a colorful quilt that looked handmade. "The bathroom is through there," he said, pointing. "There's hot water, and food when you're ready. No rush." He didn't ask her story, didn't pry into the shadows he surely saw in her eyes. He simply gave her what she needed most: a door she could close, a warm space to breathe, and the unspoken promise that for tonight she was safe from the storm. Standing under the stream of hot water, Ilara felt as if she were washing away more than just the dust of the road. She was washing away the grime of her past, the feel of unwanted hands, the stench of fear and shame. The water ran in brown rivulets down the drain, and with it she let go of the girl who had stood on that highway. She emerged wrapped in a towel, her skin clean, her spirit lighter than it had been in a year. She found Jesse in the main room, placing 2 steaming bowls of stew on the small wooden table before the fire. He had laid out a clean shirt and a pair of sweatpants for her, folded neatly on the chair. She put them on, the soft, worn cotton a comfort against her skin. They ate in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the gentle clinking of their spoons against the bowls. After they ate, Ilara found herself looking at the intricate carving on the mantelpiece. A soaring eagle, its wings outstretched. "You made this?" she asked, her voice soft. Jesse nodded. "My grandfather taught me. He said the wood tells you what it wants to be. You just have to be quiet enough to listen." Ilara understood. It was the same with her grandmother's beadwork. Each bead was a word, each pattern a prayer you had to listen for. In that shared understanding, a fragile thread of connection was spun between them. Days turned into a week. The storm passed, leaving the air clean and the earth smelling of rain and sage. Ilara fell into a quiet rhythm at the cabin. She helped Jesse with small chores, feeding the chickens, tending the small garden out back. She never spoke of her past, and he never asked. But the truth of her pregnancy was becoming a gentle, swelling curve that could not be hidden by a loose shirt. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch mending one of Jesse's shirts, her needle moving in the same steady rhythm her grandmother had taught her, Jesse came and sat in the chair beside her. He didn't look at her, but out at the distant mountains. "There's a good doctor in town," he said quietly. "A woman. Kind. Gentle. I can take you whenever you're ready." Tears pricked Ilara's eyes. He wasn't judging her. He was offering her care. He was seeing her and her child, not as a problem, but as people who needed help. "I have no money," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. Jesse finally turned to look at her, his gaze steady. I'm not asking for money, Alara. I'm offering a hand. That's what people are supposed to do for each other. The visit to the doctor was both terrifying and miraculous. Hearing the strong, steady heartbeat of her baby for the first time was like hearing a sacred drum, a rhythm that connected her to the endless chain of mothers and daughters who had come before her. It was real. This life inside her was real, and it was strong. For the first time, a fierce, protective love bloomed in her heart, pushing aside the weeds of shame. Walking out of the clinic into the bright sunlight, Alara felt different. The ghostly, invisible girl who had arrived at Jesse's cabin was beginning to fade, replaced by someone new, someone with a purpose. She was going to be a mother. That single, powerful truth became her anchor, her compass, her North Star. That evening, sitting by the fire, she found the courage to speak. She told Jesse her story, the words tumbling out in a broken, halting whisper. She spoke of a boy on the reservation whose promises had turned to threats, of a family who had turned their backs on her in shame, of the crushing loneliness that had driven her to the road. She told him everything, expecting to see disgust or pity in his eyes. Instead, she saw only a deep, quiet compassion that made a space for her pain without judgment. When she had finished, her voice raw, the silence in the room was thick with unspoken emotion. Jesse then did something that surprised her. He rolled up the sleeve of his left arm, revealing a long, jagged scar that ran from his wrist to his elbow. "Rodeo," he said simply. "A bull named Midnight. He taught me that some things break you in ways you can't see." He then told her his own story. He spoke of a wife he had loved more than the sunrise, a musician with a laugh like wind chimes, who had been taken by a sickness that came on fast and cruel. He spoke of the silence she had left behind, a silence so loud it had driven him from the city, out here to this small cabin where he could heal, or at least try to. "We're all running from something, Alara," he said, his voice thick. "And we all carry scars. Some are just easier to see than others." In that moment of shared vulnerability, Alara no longer felt like a victim. She felt like a survivor. They were two broken people, their spirits scarred and battered, who had found a moment of grace in each other's company. The fragile thread of connection between them strengthened, woven now with the tough sinew of shared pain and mutual respect. As the weeks turned into months, the gentle swell of Alara's belly grew more pronounced. The cabin, once a temporary shelter, began to feel like something more. Jesse cleared out a small storage room, sanding the floors and painting the walls a soft, sunny yellow. Together they assembled a small wooden crib he had ordered from a catalog. Each nail hammered, each wall painted, was an act of creation, of building a space not just for a baby, but for a future. Alara's hands, once idle, became busy. Using scraps of fabric and thread she found in an old sewing box, she began to stitch a baby blanket. She didn't have beads, so she used colored thread to create the traditional patterns of her people, the symbol of the turtle for long life, the hummingbird for joy, the dragonfly for renewal. With each stitch, she wove a prayer for her child, a story of hope and love. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the fireflies begin their nightly dance, Alara felt a wave of panic wash over her. This peace, this warmth, this feeling of safety. It was a borrowed dream. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "A home." Jesse turned to her, his expression serious. He reached out and gently took her hand, his calloused thumb stroking her knuckles. "Home isn't a place with four walls, Alara," he said softly. "You are my home now." His words hung in the air between them, more real and solid than the cabin walls. "You are my home now." It wasn't a declaration of romantic love, not yet, but something deeper, more fundamental. It was an acknowledgement of the space she had come to fill in his life, the silence she had chased away. He was telling her that her presence had rebuilt something in him that he thought was gone forever. Ilara looked at their joined hands, her smooth brown skin against his weathered pale skin. She realized that home wasn't about deserving, it was about belonging. In this quiet valley, with this quiet man, she had found a place where she belonged. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was seen. She was valued. She was, in some small, miraculous way, home. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sadness. It was a tear of gratitude, of a profound and overwhelming sense of peace. She squeezed his hand, a silent answer that he seemed to understand completely. The fireflies danced in the growing dark, and for the first time, Ilara felt her own light begin to dance with them. The news of a pregnant girl living with the reclusive cowboy in the valley traveled through the small nearby town like a grass fire. It reached the reservation, carried on the wind of gossip and speculation. One day, a dusty car Ilara recognized rumbled up the long driveway to the cabin. Her uncle and cousin stepped out, their faces hard masks of disapproval. The snake from her past had found her. They didn't come with open arms, but with demands. They spoke of shame, of dishonor to the family name. They insisted she come back with them, that the child be handled quietly. They didn't see a healing young woman, a future mother. They saw a problem, a stain that needed to be erased. Ilara's newfound peace shattered, the old fear returning with the force of a physical blow. Jesse stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself slightly in front of Ilara. He wasn't aggressive, but his presence was a solid, unmovable wall. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice calm but laced with steel. "This is her home, and you're not welcome in it." Her uncle sneered, his eyes filled with contempt for this white man who dared to interfere. "This is family business, cowboy." Jesse's gaze didn't waver. "She is my family." Seeing Jesse stand for her, a shield against the family who should have protected her, ignited something in Ilara. The spirit of the mother bear, the protector of its cub, rose up within her, fierce and powerful. She stepped out from behind Jesse, her chin held high, her hand resting on her belly, not in fear, but in defiance. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong, a bell ringing in the tense silence. "My family is the one who gives me shelter, not shame. My family is the one who offers a hand, not a fist. This child," she declared, her voice ringing with a conviction that stunned her relatives into silence, "will be born into a home of love and respect, not judgment. You will not touch us." Her uncle and cousin, faced with a strength they had never seen in her, a fire they could not extinguish, were left speechless. They had come expecting a broken, compliant girl. They found a woman, a mother, who had drawn a line in the dust. With a final, hateful glare, they got back in their car and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and the echo of their prejudice behind them. As autumn painted the cottonwood leaves in brilliant shades of gold, Ilara's time grew near. The first snow of the season came early, a gentle, silent blessing that covered the valley in a blanket of pure white. It wasn't the cold, threatening snow of her journey, but a cleansing, peaceful snow that promised rest and renewal. Jesse grew more attentive, his quiet care a constant, reassuring presence. He chopped extra firewood, stocked the pantry, and made sure the old truck was ready for a sudden trip to town. They spent the evenings by the fire, talking, not of their painful pasts, but of a hopeful future. They talked of names for the baby, of lullabies to be sung, of a life they were now building together. One evening, as the snow fell softly outside the window, Ilara felt the first unmistakable sign that her baby was ready to meet the world. A wave of calm washed over her. She was not afraid. She was in a warm, safe home, with a man she trusted, a man who had become her anchor in the storm. She was ready. The birth was long and difficult, but Ilara was not alone. Jesse was by her side the entire time, his hand a constant source of strength for her to hold on to. In the sterile, quiet room of the small hospital, he was her advocate, her comfort, her family. When the first lusty cry of her daughter filled the room, it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of a promise fulfilled, of a new beginning. They named her Mai, which meant coyote in the old language, a symbol of resilience, cleverness, and the spirit of a survivor. She was beautiful, with a shock of dark hair and eyes that held the wisdom of the ancestors. Holding her daughter in her arms for the first time, Ilara felt her heart crack open, not with pain, but with a love so vast and powerful it remade her entire world. Jesse looked at the mother and child, his eyes shining with an emotion Ilara had never seen before. It was a look of profound awe and tenderness. He gently reached out a finger, and Mai's tiny hand instinctively wrapped around it. In that small, perfect moment, a new family was born, not of blood, but of choice, of circumstance, of a love that had grown quietly in the shelter of a lonely cabin. Bringing Mai home to the cabin was a sacred act. The small yellow room was waiting, the crib ready. The home that had once been a refuge for two broken souls was now a home for a family. Mai's presence filled the quiet spaces, her small coos and cries chasing away the last of the ghosts of their pasts. The cabin was no longer silent. It was filled with the music of life. Jesse was a natural with the baby, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle. He would walk her by the fire when she cried, his low, rumbling voice humming old cowboy songs that soothed her to sleep. Ilara would watch them, her heart so full she felt it might burst. She saw in him not just a kind man, but a father, a partner, a man who had not just saved her, but had built a new world with her. Her own identity was reforged. She was no longer Ilara, the runaway, the victim. She was Ilara, Mai's mother. This new name was the most important map of all, and it pointed directly to the future. It was a future she would build with her own hands, with love, with strength, and with the man who had shown her the true meaning of home. Ilara's hands, now comforted and sure, returned to her art. With materials Jesse bought for her in town, she began creating intricate beadwork again. She made baby moccasins for Mai, headbands, and small pouches, her fingers weaving the stories of her journey into each piece. She beaded the story of the moon over the highway, the rust-colored truck, the cabin by the creek, and the eagle on the mantel. Jesse, seeing the beauty and skill in her work, built a small display shelf in the corner of the town's general store, which his friend owned. He didn't ask her, he just did it, a quiet act of faith in her talent. To Ilara's astonishment, the pieces began to sell. Tourists and locals alike were drawn to the vibrant colors and the powerful stories woven into the beads. What began as a way to pass the time became a small, thriving business. For the first time in her life, Ilara was earning her own money, building something from her own skill and heritage. It was a profound step, not just toward financial independence, but toward reclaiming her own power and worth. She was not just a resident in Jesse's home. She was a contributor, a partner in building their shared life. One day, a car, different from the one her uncle had driven, made its way to the cabin. An old woman got out, her hair in two long silver braids, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles. It was her grandmother. She had heard the stories, not the hateful gossip, but the whispers of Ilara's survival, of her art, of the beautiful baby. She had come not with judgment, but with love. The reunion was a flood of tears and whispered words in their native tongue. Her grandmother held Mai, tears streaming down her face, and sang the old lullabies, her voice a fragile, beautiful connection to their shared past. She looked at Jesse, not with suspicion, but with a deep, knowing gratitude. She saw what he had done for her granddaughter, that he had honored her spirit. She had brought with her Ilara's old beading supplies, the precious beads and tools that had been passed down through generations. "A woman's story must be told," she said, placing the worn leather pouch in Ilara's hands. "You have a new story now, a good one. Tell it." The circle, which had been broken by shame, was now being mended by love and forgiveness. On Mai's first birthday, the cabin was filled with a small group of friends: the doctor, the owner of the general store, Jesse's ranch hand neighbors. Ilara's grandmother sat in the rocking chair, holding her great-granddaughter, her face glowing with pride. Ilara, wearing a dress she had made, adorned with her own beadwork, moved through the small gathering with a grace and confidence that was breathtaking. Later that evening, after everyone had left, she and Jesse stood on the porch, watching the full moon rise over the mountains, the same moon that had watched her, desperate and alone on the side of the highway. She was no longer that girl. She was a mother, an artist, a partner, a woman who had found her strength. Jesse wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her head. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the moonlight spill across the valley. The love between them was no longer unspoken. It was in every shared glance, every quiet touch, every action they took to build their life together. It was a love that had grown slowly, surely, like the deep-rooted cottonwoods by the creek. What happens when a soul, convinced it is a ghost, is seen for the very first time? It is born again. Ilara looked up at the vast, star-dusted sky, the same sky her ancestors had navigated by, and she knew the answer to the question that had begun her journey. When a lost soul is truly seen, it is given a new map, a map of the heart. Her map had led her here, to this man, to this child, to this life. It wasn't a life free of scars, but the scars were now part of her story, a testament to her survival. The shame had been washed away, replaced by a deep, abiding love that had healed the broken places in both her and Jesse. She turned in his arms, her hand coming up to rest on his heart. The steady, reassuring beat was the rhythm of her new life. "I love you," she whispered, the words as easy and natural as breathing. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that was a promise of 1,000 sunrises to come. "I love you," he answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Welcome home." And she was. Finally and forever, she was home.